Hey, so it's another day. We're back in the workshop. Today's project, we're going to be putting some new brake pads on the Yamaha Viking. As some of you might recall from the other videos I had done, this was something that we had rebuilt last fall. And, I had done the general maintenance and everything that kind of went along with the drivetrain and the body and everything just as I was reassembling the unit. But I never got around to the brake pads. And now that we're starting to get back into spring, the weather's warming up a little bit. I have the side-by-side in the garage, and I thought it would be a good time to swap out the brake pads, not necessarily from a stopping perspective, but mostly just the squeak. I don't really know the condition of them as it is, and brake pads all around aren't too expensive for this unit. So what I've got is a set of front, back, and then parking brake pads. These are just, they're just something you can find on Amazon, this niche brand. But I went with the organic pads instead of the semi-metallic or ceramic. Ceramic's just expensive. The semi-metallic, although they last a little bit longer, I've known them to kind of squeak a little bit sooner. And since I'm not putting a ton of miles on this thing, I thought I'd just go with the organic ones. So I'll kind of show you how we go about putting these things on. It's not too difficult. But just to give you guys an overview to let you know what you're getting into when you go and do this project for yourself. So I'm looking at the driver's side front wheel. And what you've got is to get the calipers off, there are two 12 millimeter bolts coming through from the top and bottom. When you remove these, they might be a little snug if you haven't done this in a while. I've had to use my impact on them before. These ones I could just do with a hand wrench, but I mean, you'll just work them out, and then be careful that you don't accidentally drop your caliper. Not so much because it's a heavy part, but just because you don't want to put extra strain on these brake lines. Once this comes off, though, you'll expose the brake pads where you can put the new ones on. Just fold it up and we'll look at it real quick. I mean, there actually is a decent amount of material on here. I know I've had problems though with kind of low quality brake pads in the past though, where they'll tend to squeak. So I'm hoping that just by replacing these, it might do the trick for me. At the same time, something I've liked to do, at least with the vehicles that I've worked on, I'll use like a wire metal brush, kind of clean these up a little bit, get any loose rust and things off of them. And it's a good opportunity while you've got everything apart too, just to have a look over and make sure you don't have any leaks or any kind of unnecessary wear build up behind the wheel. So anyway, so that was a 12 millimeter nut that went through here to hold the caliper in place. And then I believe to get the actual shoe or the actual, to get the actual pads off, it's going to be these hex bolts going through. There's two of them here and here. So get those off, and then both of the pads should come off pretty easily. We'll slide the new ones in and go back in. So maybe a little trick here. I ended up using my smaller impact. This is a 5 millimeter hex driver on there. But I needed to use that instead of my hand ratchet just because it's kind of hard to torque on this while you're holding it at the same time. So I suppose maybe if you were going to do this yourselves, or what I'll do on probably the remaining three, is that I'll actually leave the caliper in place, take these guys out first just to loosen them while it's still secured and I've got something holding it for me, and then I'll take the caliper off. But as you can see, these are just they're kind of a pin, like what you might see on a larger vehicle. It just extends through, and that just gives you the surface for the brake pads to kind of float on, kind of on the neck portion of this. So there's two of them. And once we get them out, I want to make sure I take note of kind of the orientation of the brakes going in, the new shoes or the new pads, just to verify that I'm getting them in correct. And another thing is that this pin feels like it's got a little bit of grease on it. So what I'll probably do is just put some wheel bearing grease on it when I reassemble it, some high temperature stuff. And I think that might help free up the potential for these pads from seizing. So we'll see if I can balance this and do it with one hand. These are the two new brake pads. There's a decent amount of material on them. The one that doesn't have this kind of ear is what actually goes in first. This will be the inside of the unit, and it kind of slides in place like this and kind of sits down in this recess. The smaller little tabs, there's a spring plate up there to keep some tension on them a little bit, but the little ears, that'll be what the pins line up with. Same on this side. So now we'll have this kind of this dog ear going up, and it'll kind of insert like this. You see how it kind of grabs onto this boss before it gets pushed up into place. So they'll sit there loose until I put the pins through. And like I said, I'm going to put some grease on them. Something I like to do, I don't know how many of you guys keep old toothbrushes around, but at least for me, I use them out in the workshop just as a way of brushing on some grease or something like that instead of getting it all over your fingers. So I'll get this assembled, put it back on, and then move on to the next. All right, last couple of comments on this before we move on. The small hex, like the internal hex, the socket head screws, those are only 12 foot-pounds of torque needed to secure those. The two larger ones that secure the caliper to the wheel assembly or to the axle assembly, those are 35 foot-pounds for when you're going to put this back together. That you may need to recompress your brake pistons a little bit, recompress the calipers on them. And that's just because as the pads wear, the piston will stay extended. So what I usually will do is use some of my channel locks and just, go slow with it. Just grab on the outside of your caliper to either the brake pad, the metal part of the brake pad, or before you put the pads on, put like a wood shim or block or something between it, and you just compress the cylinder. I'll show you that in a little bit better detail with the rear. So here we are set up on the rear. This is a passenger side rear. It's just like the front, essentially, just smaller pads go on it. But you've got the two hex bolts on the top and bottom, and then there's the socket-headed, smaller kind of pin bolts that hold the brake pads on in here. Take it all apart. When you put everything back together, grease the pins. These are the 35 foot-pounds, the larger ones, and then the smaller ones are the 12 foot-pounds. And like I said, you may need to compress the calipers a little bit as you're doing it. So what happened there is down inside of this caliper is there's a small spring clip down by those two pins that you kind of see between the two pads. And that spring clip pushes pressure towards the center axle on those pads. It's kind of a way of keeping them from rattling and keeping them kind of aligned with the two guide pins. On this rear brake, though, it seemed like maybe that spring pad was maybe a little deformed or something. I was having a little bit of an issue getting these pads in straight. As you saw, I had to do it a couple times in order to get them so that they were parallel. I had the pins kind of pinching And that's something to keep an eye out for when you're doing this yourself. You don't want to put these back together with them cockeyed or anything, because then they won't move freely like they're meant to do. So I'm looking at the rear of the side-by-side, and we're going to tackle the parking brake after getting these four-wheel brakes replaced. What we've got to get this guy off is there's, let's see, a hex bolt here, and then another one just like it down below. I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to right on top of my fingernail there. Those look like those are probably, I don't know, like a 14 millimeter or so. And what I think I'm going to do is just put a really long extension on here and just hit it from, back here and kind of hit it. And that should free up the caliper. It should be able to swing up with the flexibility of the parking brake cable. On the back side of the parking brake caliper, there is this lever mechanism. Let me get my hand in here. So there's this lever mechanism. There's a 12 millimeter hex nut. So you can loosen this, back this out a little bit, and that'll actually open the jaws of the caliper a little bit of the parking brake. I haven't done that yet. I suspect I might need to, though, just to get the new pads on, which are going to be a little bit more material than what had been there. So just something to keep in mind. So let's get this set up and give it a try. So it was a 14 millimeter. Looks like the extension works for the lower side one. I don't think I'll be able to use that for the upper side. And something also maybe to keep in mind, and I suppose this is probably intuitive to most, but you're going to want to leave the parking brake off while you're working on this. If you leave it on, what it'll do is it'll seize it up and keep you from being able to remove the caliper. So I think I'm actually going to just swap this out in place. I can get the caliper far enough off that I can loosen these pins on the other side. Unfortunately, there's too much going on back here that I can't wiggle it off without taking a whole lot more apart than I feel like today. Unless one of you guys knows a tip or trick, feel free to let me know. But I'm just using my socket head screw here. My socket hex driver, little 5 millimeter one, the same one we used on the front and rear brakes. And I'm going to take these pins out. They're a lot shorter than the ones on the sides. So these look to be identical pads, both sides, so it shouldn't matter which way they go in. There's still a decent amount of material to this. Same condition as the wheels, but we'll replace them anyways and get this bolted back in. I'm going to try to get some grease on there in the same way that I did with the pins of the wheels. A little harder to show it from here though. Well, we got the the brake pads separated enough to get them up across this disc. Admit it was quite a few angry words to do it. And that's like I said, mostly because we've got all these cross members in the way of where you're trying to access. I suppose if I was a little bit more of a patient man, the better approach might have been to take off the splash guard underneath, work that way up instead of the way I'm doing. Nevertheless, we've got that much of it done. These are the larger bolts that secure the caliper to your rear differential. So it's a 14 millimeter bolt, and it's going to 35 foot-pounds again. So I know I wasn't able to film most of that as I was putting things together, but kind of just to recap how the process goes. You'll find it easiest if you disconnect this spring from the lower portion down there. You can pull straight down and disconnect the spring. Leave it hanging on the arm up here. You'll have to loosen this 12 millimeter hex nut. Don't take it too far off though, because if you take it too far off, then this arm will come off of the, there's kind of like a hex feature, a key set thing. So don't loosen this so far that the arm slides off of that, just enough that it's loose. Then there are two 14 millimeter hex bolts, this guy and then the one down there. You can take both those out this way, and that'll free up the caliper enough you can slide it around. I think if you took off your splash pan down below, you can probably work from underneath. But at least as far as how I had done it, I took these out, wiggled it free enough that I could get my hex driver in from this side, take out those two brake pad pins, slide those out like that, and then I could get the old pads out and the new ones in, put the pins back in with grease, tighten those down, bring the caliper back in, tighten this down to 35 foot-pounds. These sockets back here were 12 foot-pounds, just like the other brakes on the side-by-side. With everything snugged down, I reattach a spring, and then you'll end up screwing this back in tight. You may have loosened it before. If you did, then you'll want to tighten it back up, righty-tighty. And what that does is that kind of preloads your pads against the parking brake disc up over here. What I did is I went until it was tight, and then actually backed it off a half turn. That way the pads aren't already clamped against the disc. I know that some wear will happen anyways, and that's fine. But at least as a starting point. And maybe what you'll do is drive it around a little bit, double check that it's holding the vehicle on the hill, that it's not going to roll or anything while you're still in it, and you can put your foot on the brake. And if it seems like it's working all right, then you're set. And if it looks like you need a little bit more tension, then screw this guy a little bit tighter. And then snug everything down, and you should be good to go. Maybe one last comment. We had done the brakes all around on the different wheels. And just like on your car, when you're doing these things, you're going to not have much pressure on your foot pedal, on your brake pedal. And that's because you've compressed all the cylinders at each of the different calipers. So before you start driving, pump the brake a couple times just to build up pressure again. And that should take care of it. Well, it took a little bit of trial and error to get it done. The wheel brakes, pretty easy to do, very straightforward. When I was off camera and not trying to, show you guys what I was doing, it probably only took like 5 or 10 minutes per wheel. So I was feeling pretty confident moving through it. The parking brake took a bit longer though. As I mentioned, I think the best way probably would have been to take the splash pan off from below and then kind of work your way up that way. Nevertheless, I'd say the whole job probably took an hour and a half or so, and that's with dinner in between. So pretty short and easy job. I'm happy to say too that took care of all the squeaks and everything that I was experiencing when I was driving around. I just took it for a spin in the yard. So that took care of everything, and the brakes seem to be working great, so well worth the time and the money. All right, guys, we'll see you on the next one. Bye.